Everything started when I woke up to the sound of someone pounding on my apartment door. That was my first moment of fear that night. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and made my way to the door. The first thing I did was check through the peephole to make sure it wasn't someone suspicious. But what greeted me was the sight of one of my neighbors. She looked terrified, covered in blood, and even through the dim hallway light I could see her face was a mess. I opened the door and she rushed inside immediately, gasping, "You have to get me out of here. My boyfriend is trying to kill me." I started asking her what had happened, but she cut me off, saying, "There's no time, please get me out of here. I swear to God, if he finds out you helped me, he'll kill you too." That sent me into full panic mode. If a guy was willing to beat his girlfriend that badly, God knows what he'd do to me. I grabbed my car keys and ran down the stairs, my neighbor right behind me. We jumped into my car and sped off into the night. I remember asking her if she had anywhere I could take her, friends, family, anything. She said no, and that the best thing to do was drive to a motel where she could call the police from there. That sounded reasonable, so that's exactly what I did. I drove us to a motel and booked a room. The front desk clerk was clearly alarmed by her appearance, but when she explained that her boyfriend had attacked her, they just said, "Oh my God, make sure you call the police." At that moment, I didn't even know her name. I only knew her as my neighbor. She said she would go up to the room and call the cops while I grabbed some ice from the ice machine for her swollen face. When I returned, she told me the police were on their way. She pressed the ice to her face and started crying. I did my best to comfort her, telling her she was safe now. When she finally calmed down, I asked her what really happened in her apartment. She told me that her boyfriend was abusive and that she had been planning to leave for a while. That night, she finally worked up the courage to tell him. But when he walked into the bedroom and saw her packing a bag, things escalated quickly. She took a small bottle of liquor from the minibar, promising she'd pay me back once everything settled down. I had no reason not to believe her at that point. After everything we had just been through, I felt like we had some kind of bond, but I stayed cautious, thinking I'd just drive back home soon. I asked her if she could wait alone for the police to arrive, but she looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Are you sure you want to leave? If my boyfriend sees the blood on your apartment door, I promise you I left some there when I slammed it. He'll know I was there. He'll come for you." I'll be honest, that freaked me out. I hadn't personally seen the blood, but she was covered in so much of it that I believed her. An hour passed and the police still hadn't shown up. The motel was shaped like a horseshoe, so if they had arrived, we would have seen them pull into the parking lot. I told her to call them again because obviously this was an emergency. That's when things started to feel off. She just gave me a dismissive response like, "I'm sure they'll be here soon." If I were in her situation, I'd be calling 911 again after 10 minutes, let alone an hour. Why was she so calm waiting for them? At the time, I chalked it up to the alcohol. I tried to ignore it. But then I really looked at her. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt and women's shorts, drenched in blood. But there were small splatters here and there like spray marks. She had a cut above her eye and a badly split lip. But there seemed to be too much blood for just those injuries. I asked her if she had any other wounds, something on her stomach or anywhere else that could explain all the blood. She said no and insisted it was all from her lip and eye. Immediately, my instincts screamed that something was wrong. I asked her again, "What exactly happened in your apartment?" And suddenly, she got weird, cagey, like she was carefully choosing her words. I had no idea what was really going on, but I was exhausted from waiting, so I decided to call the police myself. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and just as I was about to dial, she asked, "What are you doing?" "Calling the cops," I said. Her entire demeanor shifted. She tensed up. "Don't do that." Something about the way she looked at me, the way she spoke, the slight edge of panic in her voice. It sent chills down my spine. The air in the room changed completely. I asked her why not, and as I pressed the call button, I looked up and saw her standing there gripping a knife. Hang up now. I'd never had someone pull a knife on me before, and I can't even describe how terrifying it was. Not just the weapon itself, but the horrifying realization that things were not at all what they seemed. I wasn't avoiding the threat. I was sitting in a room with it. I begged her not to hurt me, and I was relieved when she said she wouldn't, as long as I drove her to the Canadian border. Since we were in Detroit, it wasn't far, but I knew I couldn't do that. I didn't want to be an accessory to whatever crime she had committed. The longer I stayed with her, the more likely I was to end up dead. So I told her I would drive her, but I needed to eat something first. I pretended I wanted to stop somewhere, knowing she wouldn't let me leave the car. Sure enough, she insisted we order food for delivery instead. That's where she messed up. She didn't realize I could leave a note on the delivery order. I used DoorDash and wrote in the instructions. Call 911, send police to motel room. Thank God there was a driver available late at night. I even showed her my phone to prove I placed the order, carefully hiding the note. The cops did exactly what I hoped. They arrived without sirens or lights, parked out of view, and walked to the door. Then they knocked, just like they were the delivery guy. She walked up to open it, and before she knew what was happening, they had their guns and tasers drawn. She had the knife tucked into the back of her shorts, but they were already prepared. She dropped hard after they tased her. Turns out she was the abusive one. She had stabbed her boyfriend nearly to death before finding some unlucky idiot, me, to drive her to the border. He had barely survived, managing to crawl to another neighbor's door for help. When I got back to my apartment complex, the place was swarmed with cops and forensic units. The next morning, they took my statement and explained everything. It was, without a doubt, the craziest, scariest thing that had ever happened to me. Even now, it doesn't feel real. But what stays with me the most? How easily I believed her lie. I thought I was helping someone I could trust. The truth is, if I had made just one wrong move that night, I might not be here to tell this story. Deep in the vast emptiness of the United States, in the early morning of March 3, 1980, a girl was born. She was the pride of her parents. From that day forward, she could do no wrong. Every birthday was a celebration of her greatness. As she grew up, she never faltered. Her beliefs always aligned with modern thinking, and her opinions were never incorrect. If you asked them, her parents would place her among the angels, nearly divine and as beautiful as one could be. It was all nonsense, of course. She was never honest with herself. The adults were unfair to her peers at school. Her grades were mediocre at best. Her awkwardness with boys was well known. No one her age respected or liked her. There were a few she controlled through fear, but in time even they would escape from the child who was nothing like the sacred being her parents believed her to be. You might ask how I know all this. You see, I was foolish enough to marry her. From here on, I'll call her Olivia. Olivia and I had known each other since high school. We grew up not far from one another. Her beauty was truly breathtaking to witness, but it was her only redeeming quality. For some strange reason, I was the man she chose. Over time, I discovered why. The way she had been raised had turned her into a narcissistic abuser. This was a major turnoff for most men at her level. I suppose men at my level were more susceptible to her feminine power. She knew she had me trapped from the start. But not once did she abuse me the way she had others. I'm not sure I would have ended it if she had. The relationship had its ups and downs, like most do. Every few months we would argue and break up, only to reunite soon after. Whenever society took something from her, I was usually the one there to lift her up. Perhaps at the time I truly believed the world was against her. She certainly acted as if it were. I never considered life without her. That was undoubtedly why I followed her to community college, despite being accepted into Stanford. I truly believed we would move there after 2 years. As usual, she barely survived those years. Her grades were abysmal, and she had to appeal after failing her first semester. After that, I did all her homework for her and pushed her relentlessly until she passed. She was never truly stupid. She had just been raised to believe that everything belonged to her by default. At the end of those 2 years, she took a dead-end job at her aunt's interior design company. When I brought up the idea of moving to California, she claimed her job was too important to leave. After much inner conflict, I gave up my dream of Stanford and found a job nearby. 4 years passed in the blink of an eye. I continued my studies, while she bounced from one dead-end job to another. Our first daughter was born. By this time, Olivia took a long time to recover mentally, but when our second daughter was born 3 years later, she seemed fine. By then, I was teaching at a high school. A last-minute death in the staff meant I also had to coach the wrestling team. This meant I spent less time at home. Olivia had long since quit working to raise our daughters, a situation I had no issue with. Unfortunately, this gave her too much time to think. She began accusing me of infidelity. The saddest part of all this was the fact that I still loved her as much as the day we met. I had never even considered other women. The accusations shattered me. The cheating allegations continued for nearly 6 months. Then, strangely, one day they all stopped. 2 days passed before I had a free day to spend with her and the girls. Everything was wonderful throughout the day. She even cooked me an amazing dinner. Afterward, I was exhausted, so I let her know I was going to bed early. I expected this, to make her angry, but she seemed calm. I should have known something was wrong when she tucked me in. She had never been the type to do that, not even with the kids. But at the time, it didn't trigger any alarms, and soon I was asleep. At some point, I was woken up by a sharp pain in my chest. I tried to get up. I also noticed a pounding sensation. Finally, I managed to open my eyes, and I saw a figure on top of me, continuously striking my chest. I was in that strange state where I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or awake. But eventually, I came to my senses. With my eyes wide open, I could now tell that the figure was Olivia. I didn't understand what she was doing, but I knew it hurt. I gathered all the strength I could and pushed her off. My hand reached for my chest, feeling something wet. It took me a second to realize that she had stabbed me. That's when I started to panic. She tried to climb on top of me again, but I fought her off. I knew I had to get away. My legs felt like I was running through mud, and I had no idea why. I didn't make it to the front door before she jumped on my back and continued attacking. My survival instincts kicked in and I threw her off me, but she lunged at me again. On impulse, I punched her twice in the jaw, knocking her unconscious. I was still in shock over what I had done. It was something I knew I could never do under any other circumstances. This gave me the chance to grab my phone and call for help. My eldest daughter had woken up from all the noise. She saw the blood all over me and started crying. I covered it up by saying I had spilled ketchup on myself. I wasn't sure if she believed me, but she went back to bed when I asked her to. By this point, I could hear Olivia trying to escape the bedroom. I no longer had the strength to stop her. I knew she had drugged me. I ran to the hallway bathroom and locked myself inside. Only then did I begin to feel the blood loss. The dispatcher did their best to keep me conscious. Lucky for them. But within minutes, everything went dark. When I woke up the next day, the pain was unbearable. My screams alerted a nurse who came in and adjusted my IV. The next few days were a blur of brief moments of consciousness. By the fourth day, I awoke, properly, still in discomfort but feeling better. The police arrived shortly after lunch, and what they told me shocked me. Olivia had charged at the officers with a knife, and they shot her. She survived and was recovering down the hall. Our daughters were with my mother, which I thanked the heavens for. This all happened in 2008. Olivia pled guilty and took a 15-year sentence. I focused on raising our daughters. My parents were an incredible support. My eldest is now graduating, and her sister isn't far behind. They've handled everything remarkably well. Olivia reached out once or twice, but they refused contact. In the end, I think Olivia suffered the most. I'm not making her a victim. She was responsible for her actions. But being away from her daughters was agony. She never fully recovered from her injuries. Just as she was about to be released, she caught COVID and passed away. It wasn't a fate anyone deserved, not even her. I used to work at a small inn that people always claimed was haunted. I worked there for about 6 or 7 months, and I never saw anything remotely supernatural. Granted, I don't believe in that kind of thing, so it's not like I was out there with an EMF meter trying to find ghosts. But one night I had a little encounter that made me question my stance on the supernatural, at least for a moment. At this particular inn, we had an on-site diner located right across from the guest rooms, all of which were on a single floor. One afternoon, we were expecting 2 elderly sisters to check in for a few nights. These women were friends of the innkeeper and fairly regular guests, staying 2 or 3 times a year, though always on his dime. I had never met them before, so I had no idea what they looked like. By the time they arrived, it was already dark. While the innkeeper greeted them and some of the other staff unloaded their luggage, I was given the task of delivering a complimentary bottle of wine to their room. The wine was supposed to be a surprise, otherwise they wouldn't accept it. The innkeeper wanted it to seem like he had gone out of his way to make the gesture special. This meant that I never actually saw the 2 elderly women arrive. Otherwise, this whole story wouldn't have happened. Since the inn was fairly empty that night, there wasn't really anyone else around. After setting the wine down in their room, I quickly stepped back outside, planning to slip away before the women could catch me leaving their little surprise. Just as I turned to go, I noticed that one of the hallway lights was flickering. Ayuan. Swear to God, it was like something straight out of a horror movie, because as I turned to look, standing right beneath the flickering light, wearing a long flowing nightgown, was a headless figure. Now here's an important piece of background information for this ridiculous story. According to the local ghost, Lori, the inn was haunted by a woman who had hanged herself. Her body supposedly went undiscovered for so long that the decomposition caused her neck to deteriorate, effectively separating her head from her body. That's why the ghost that haunted the inn was said to be headless. I know it's the dumbest ghost story you've ever heard. But imagine being me in that moment, staring at what appeared to be a headless figure standing under a flickering light. You can probably understand why my heart rate went from 0 to 60 in an instant. I think I gasped so loudly that my lungs nearly burst. And that sound must have startled the figure, because it suddenly turned around. Yeah, it wasn't a ghost. As I said, there's no such thing as ghosts or spirits or anything like that. But there is such a thing as osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a condition that severely weakens the bones, and in elderly people, it can cause some painful posture issues. Or in the case of this poor old woman, it had weakened her bones so much that she could barely hold her own head up. From behind, it genuinely looked like she had no head at all. Anyway, she turned to face me, looking deeply offended by my horrified gasp. I had to stumble through some awkward explanation like, "Oh, sorry. I didn't see you there. You startled me." She just frowned, pointed up at the flickering light and said something sarcastic like, "Better get that fixed, young man, Before shuffling off down the hallway, I felt like the biggest idiot in the world. I had spent months dismissing the ghost stories as nonsense, only to nearly give myself a heart attack over an elderly woman with severe osteoporosis. I won't lie, this was easily one of the creepiest and most embarrassing moments of my life. I've been working as a janitor at a local high school for a few years now, and it's one of the easiest jobs I've ever had. It's not a big school since the town I work in is relatively small, so I'm the only night shift custodian. Most of all, my tasks involve moving from building to building, mopping floors and picking up trash. It's a pretty laid-back job, though it can get a little lonely at times. One night I was called in a bit later than usual because the other custodian had requested to stay for some overtime. I took over his shift after he left, and before long, I was the only person in the building. I believe it was a Monday night, if I remember correctly. I was following my usual routine, mopping the hallway, when I suddenly heard the sound of a door slamming shut. My first thought was that the doorstop I had placed to keep the door open had somehow moved, so I went to check it out. I was pretty sure I had closed all the doors on that floor, so I was surprised to find one still open. When I stepped into the classroom to investigate, I heard a faint noise and poked my head inside, expecting to find the doorstop on the floor. Sure enough, it was there. But then I noticed something else, something off. One of the metal lockers had a hand gripping its edge. Just a single finger was wrapped around the corner, and because of the angle, I couldn't see who was hiding behind it. I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I quickly locked the door and got out of there as fast as I could, practically running out of the building while calling security. When they arrived, I led them back to the classroom where I had seen the person hiding. But when we got there, the room was empty. The only thing out of place was an open window. The whole situation didn't make sense. We were on the third floor, at least 40 feet above the ground. There was no way someone could have jumped out and survived. The security guard gave me a skeptical look, like he didn't believe a word I was saying. I later explained the whole thing to my girlfriend, but instead of believing me, she lectured me about not getting enough sleep. Looking back, I don't blame her, but I know what I saw. A few days later, I called in sick, so another custodian covered the night shift for me. While he was cleaning the floors in the second building, he discovered a filthy homeless man hiding inside one of the storage lockers. The man suddenly attacked him with a large meat cleaver, causing a massive amount of blood to spill onto the floor. Luckily, a police officer was stationed nearby and must have heard the commotion from upstairs. Long story short, the officer tased the man and he was arrested. The janitor survived but needed a lot of stitches. To this day, I have no idea how that man got into the school without being noticed. The security here is usually strict about letting outsiders in, unless they're parents or authorized visitors. I worked there for another month after that incident, but never saw anything unusual again. When I was about 19 years old, I had my first real job working at a gas station that spring. It wasn't the highest paying job, but it was enough to get my foot in the door and start paying for college and other expenses. I lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment paid for by my parents, but in the meantime I worked to cover other costs. The managers were idiots. They scheduled me for a week of night shifts even though they knew I had classes at 7 a.m. every morning. It was frustrating, but I really needed the money. On night shifts, people would constantly come and go to get gas, but around 10 p.m. business would slow down significantly. After that, I'd usually only get a shady customer or two every hour, stopping in for a snack or a pack of cigarettes. Still, it wasn't too bad. I had a few hours to relax. One night I was going through my shift as usual and had just finished serving what I thought was my last customer for the night. I was wrapping things up and getting ready to leave when a car pulled up right in front of the store. A man stepped out. He wore a stained white shirt, had an unkempt beard, and messy hair. He walked straight in. I greeted him and asked if I could help him with anything, but he completely ignored me, heading straight to the fridge and grabbing a six-pack of beer. I lived in the South, so guys like him weren't uncommon. I told him his total, and then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "Hey, you're really pretty. I like your hair." I gave him an awkward smile and muttered a quick, "Thanks." He stepped closer, handing me a $10 bill, making sure our hands touched. I gave him his change and told him to have a good night, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone. Thankfully, he did. I waited for my co-worker, who was supposed to take over my shift so I could go home, but he was late. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. I was getting annoyed. Just as I was about to call him and see where he was, I noticed something, or rather someone, lurking behind one of the gas pumps. It was hard to see clearly, but under the dim lights, I could tell it was the same man from earlier. I had no idea what he was doing, but it was obvious that something wasn't right. Then he stepped out from behind the pump, and I saw that he was hiding something behind his back. I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys and headed for my car when I saw him making his way toward the front door. His expression had changed. His eyes were filled with anger, and something even more unsettling. Suddenly, he pulled out a gun and aimed it at me, as if he wanted to make sure I knew he was armed. Heart pounding, I frantically dialed 911 on my phone. Before I could do anything else, he fired a shot at the lock and stormed inside. He screamed at me while keeping the gun pointed at me, demanding that I empty the cash register, or he wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and handed him all the money we had. He then ran out, speeding off down the road. I broke down crying as I spoke with the 911 dispatcher, who told me to stay on the line until the police arrived. Fortunately, he didn't get far. The police tracked him down, and it turned out he was a wanted man, charged with sexual assault and murder. His victims included 2 family members, one of whom was his wife, and 2 gas station employees just like me. The next day, I quit that job and started working at a local supermarket instead. So this happened over 2 years ago, at the end of 2016. I had just started a new job at a motel. The pay was low, but I needed an office job for my training program. A friend of mine, Daniel, helped me find this job within a few days. I was trained by the owner in the mornings, and for 2 nights, Daniel trained me as well. Our job was the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Nothing too exciting, just checking in guests and handling paperwork. Music. My boss, the motel owner, had gone on vacation with his wife for a week. Supposedly, thanks to the quick training I had endured, I was now on my first solo night shift. There was a monitor displaying security camera footage from around the motel, and large glass windows surrounded the office building. Unlike most motels, there was no night window, just a glass door. It was still relatively early, around 1 a.m., and I was just doing some paperwork when a man walked in and asked if we had any available rooms. Normally, if someone seemed suspicious, my boss instructed me to lie and say we were fully booked. But this guy seemed normal enough. However, we had just had a meeting about customer satisfaction, and my boss had really encouraged us to be more polite to guests. Without hesitation, I said, "Oh yes, of course, just one moment." He replied, "Okay." As I began processing his reservation on the computer, I noticed he was swatting at the air and making spitting noises as if he were surrounded by flies. I tried to ignore it. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't my business, so I focused on getting him into a room as quickly as possible. I handed him the key, and he headed toward his room. At that time, I could be described as very shy, and I had a lot going on in my personal life. I hope you all can understand my reaction to what happened next. The man returned from his room and slammed his hand against the glass door, making me jump. Terrified, I looked up to see him staring at me. He opened the door, stuck his head in, and said, "I can't get into my room. Why won't you let me in?" My only excuse was that I was just trying to be helpful, so I replied, "Oh, maybe there's something wrong with your key. Let me get you another one." His expression was unreadable, and I felt an overwhelming sense of danger. I handed him a new key and he went back to his room. I tried texting Daniel, since he had trained me, but it was the middle of the night and he was asleep. I needed some guidance, but there was no response. I then noticed the man slowly shuffling back down the stairs and I went into full panic mode. I ran to the back office, locked the door, and pulled out my pocket knife. Keeping something for self-defense while working night shifts was crucial. Meanwhile, I could hear the man shouting in the office, "Hello? Hello? Why won't you let me into my room? Don't you like me?" I was an idiot for not standing my ground and calling the police when I felt scared. Instead, I decided to handle the situation myself. I answered, "I was just on the phone. I'll be right out." Then I started calling Daniel over and over for help, but there was still no answer. I took a few deep breaths and finally stepped out of the office. However, the man was no longer there. He was in the bathroom. That's when I started hearing him mutter to himself, "Killer, killer, killer." My heart dropped. Still being an idiot, I didn't call the police. When he came out, I nervously said, "Oh, your key must have been faulty. I'm sorry about that. Let me walk you to your room." He agreed. Thankfully, I was wearing a long-sleeved sweater, so I was able to conceal the knife in my hand as I held it tightly. We started walking toward the staircase, heading for his room. I was sweating from sheer anxiety, cautiously glancing back to ensure he wasn't about to make a move. He stopped at a room, and I paused a few doors away at his actual room. I smiled and said, "Oh, that's the wrong room. This one is yours," as clearly marked on the door. The entire time he had been trying to enter someone else's room. I quickly rushed back to the office and locked the door. The next guest I checked in that night happened to be a police officer from another town. I felt bad for leaving the situation to him, but he seemed willing to keep an eye on things. The following night, the strange man returned, but this time the doors were locked. I told him we were fully booked. When my boss returned from vacation, I explained what had happened. However, he didn't take me seriously. I continued working the night shift at that motel for another year, where many other strange encounters took place. To the creepy man, I hope we never meet again. If you ever feel unsafe, always call the police. The older I get, the harder it becomes to ignore the wrongdoings of my past. I recently turned 36, and I can no longer hide from what I have done or pretend I don't feel an indescribable level of guilt. I am writing this anonymously as a way to confess my crimes in some form. My fear of prison is only matched by the thought of losing my family. Being separated from them would be a fate worse than death. If I am not careful, the truth may die with me, and that will have to be the way it is. Once this story is posted, the account will be abandoned and left to the whims of Reddit. Reaching out to me would be a waste of time. You are better off reading this and moving on with your day. This confession is made purely for my own sake. No one needs to act on this information, and you will gain nothing by doing so. My troubles may stem from my childhood. Unlike many of my friends, my parents remained married to this day. Punishments were never unreasonable or excessive, but that was the only time my father ever really paid attention to me. He existed only as a financial provider. Even now, we have no real emotional connection. I provide this information only to illustrate the emptiness I have carried throughout most of my life. Then again, I may have been emotionally stunted from the start. I suppose the reason doesn't matter. When you think about it, most of them are nothing but cowardly excuses. And no matter what I am about to say is disgusting and should be seen as such. I know what I did was wrong. The real problems began when I left home for college. Not being particularly intelligent put me at a significant disadvantage. My grades were already low before I befriended some locals, but it didn't take long for me to start spiraling downward. For anonymity's sake, I will call these two guys Ryan and Marcus. We met at a local bar that served us despite being underage. My parents didn't drink, and I had only tried alcohol once before college, which gave me a very warped relationship with it from the start. I drank until I vomited every time. Maybe that's why those two liked me so much. I had no off switch once I got started, just like them. Soon I was using drugs with them, and I don't mean a little bit of weed. I dove straight into the deep end and barely touched the surface for the next 14 years. You can probably guess what happened. By my second year, I was expelled. I didn't bother telling my parents. They only figured it out after I stopped coming home for the holidays. Honestly, I was relieved when it happened. I didn't have to take on a mountain of debt like most of my peers. Regardless, I started working odd jobs and selling drugs to get by, mostly cocaine and ecstasy. Partying became my sole purpose in life. My drinking and drug use spiraled further out of control, leading to the story I am about to share. I like to think I wouldn't have done anything like this otherwise. It happened during one of my drunken, drug-fueled nights. I was with Marcus. I'm not sure where Ryan was, but I doubt it matters. I remember being high since around lunchtime, and by the time we reached the bar, it was already dark. By chance, we ran into another guy from the neighborhood. He was a few years younger than me and had an annoying little brother-type energy. Then, the night progressed. This kid drank more and became increasingly belligerent toward us. I don't know if he thought he was being funny or was trying to act tough, but it didn't matter. After an hour of this, we'd had enough. When he stumbled off to the restroom, we started planning, not to kill him, but to give him a beating he wouldn't forget. When he came back, we offered him some coke. He agreed, but we had different plans. We all piled into my car and drove to a secluded spot we had been to before. He didn't see it coming, as far as I could tell. Even when we stood in front of him prepared to strike, he was still asking about the coke. I believe I was the first to hit him. After that, no one kept track. If I had been sober, I would have stopped much sooner, but neither of us were. The beating lasted around 5 minutes, just enough to make our point. I don't think we kicked him in the head. Like I said, this was just to teach him a lesson. When we finished, we rolled him onto his back. He was still breathing, I remember that specifically. I also remember the gurgling sound in his throat as he did. In our drug-addled minds, we thought it was funny to leave him in the middle of nowhere. We propped his beaten body against a tree and abandoned him there. Not once did I think he was dead or even close to it. I had been beaten far worse in the past and partied the next day. Speaking of the next day, the horror of what we had done hit me hard. I tried to justify it in my mind. When I couldn't anymore, I got high until I could ignore it. We weren't sure if the beating was enough to keep the kid quiet. We hoped it was. If not, we at least hoped that from then on, drugs were the only reason he had ever hung around us in the first place. When he disappeared, I don't remember anyone mentioning him or even asking about him afterward. The incident was just a fleeting moment in the spiral of my addiction, but I was able to forget it incredibly fast. Many other situations would follow, though none as depraved as this. Years passed in a haze. My so-called friends would sell me out the moment they got the chance. Even that night was never brought up again. While I may sound bitter about what they did, prison turned out to be a blessing in disguise. For the first time in years, I was forced to confront my issues, except for one. For a long time, I wasn't sure if it had even happened. Now I know that was just my brain's way of coping. I've been clean for over 4 years now. The truth of that night becomes clearer with each passing day. There hasn't been a single night in the past year where I haven't relived it in my dreams. Nightmares might be the more fitting term. Last night was the final straw, waking up drenched in sweat and screaming as my wife shook me. If I don't at least tell someone what happened, I will lose my mind. And I can't tell my wife I'd rather die. She knows parts of my past, but I'm certain hearing this would destroy her love for me. That's a sacrifice I am unwilling to make. One thing you may have noticed, I never said whether the victim died from the beating. The truth is, I don't know. I've been too afraid to search for any information, knowing full well it could force me to make an irreversible choice. One that would surely destroy my family. For now, I have to hope that this confession can ease even a fraction of the disgust and guilt I feel. If it works for me, it should not affect you in any way. Your role as the reader ends here, whether you think about this or not. Don't let it linger beyond the seconds after you click away. For your own sake and the sake of those you love, think carefully before stepping into the world of drugs and alcohol. Let my wife be an example to you. I once considered myself a kind and decent person. As you can see, drug use stripped that away from me. If you don't care about yourself, remember, there are still people who do. Growing up in California, I often heard my older brother and his friends talk about the abandoned towns scattered across the desert. They would explore these forgotten places, venturing into old buildings and sharing incredible stories of their adventures. So, it wasn't a surprise to my family when, as soon as my friends and I were able to drive, we started doing the exact same thing. Most of the time, we visited places my brother had already told us about, but occasionally, we would find something online and decide to be the first among our group to check it out. These trips led to some pretty wild stories to share when we all gathered at the beach. But there was one particular experience that still haunts me and my two friends, Lucas and Adrian. The three of us had heard about a ghost town deep in the middle of nowhere, and we thought it would be the perfect place to visit and explore for a day. One weekend, when we were all free, we grabbed our cameras and hit the road. The drive took about 3 hours, with the last hour being especially desolate. Hardly any signs of life beyond a few gas stations and rest stops. When we finally arrived, it was clear the town had been abandoned for years. Most of the buildings were single-story homes, their windows shattered, and many roofs had caved in. We spent the first hour just walking along the cracked pavement, peeking into houses from the outside. Most of them were locked, and we had no intention of breaking in. However, one building at the end of a side road caught our attention. It was partially covered with a tarp, seemingly placed to patch up a broken section of the roof. Curiosity got the better of us, and we approached. It almost looked like someone had tried to turn it into a temporary home. That's when we all started to feel uneasy, realizing at the same moment that we might not actually be alone in this supposedly abandoned town. Adrian reassured Lucas and me, and we all agreed that while someone might have stayed there before, the chances of them still being around were slim. So we cautiously moved closer to take a look inside. As I neared the window, I listened carefully for any sounds from within. Everything seemed silent. I pressed my face against the glass, my breath fogging it up slightly, and through the misty blur, I could make out broken furniture and piles of trash left behind. I signaled for Lucas and Adrian to come take a look. But just as they reached the window, something sent a chill down my spine. Sitting on a small table near the couch was a shotgun, and even from that distance, I could tell it was in pristine condition, the cleanest thing in the house. That meant someone was still here. That was the moment we heard the sound of approaching vehicles. We couldn't tell exactly what they were, maybe dirt bikes or ATVs, but they were getting closer. Lucas and Adrian turned to see where the noise was coming from, and just as I was about to join them, a scream erupted from inside the house. A man appeared from around the corner of the room, his face twisted in fury as he let out another yell, right next to the window. The three of us bolted instantly, sprinting as fast as we could. We dashed through the yards of the abandoned houses, trying our best to stay out of sight as the sounds of engines grew louder. The vehicles eventually passed us, heading straight for the house we had just fled from. We ran all the way back to our car, parked about half a mile away on the road. Just as we started heading back, we heard something that made our stomachs drop. The engines were coming back, and they were heading in our direction. Adrian wasted no time starting the car, and we sped away, making our way back home as fast as possible. When I finally walked into my house, I felt relieved to see my brother, eager to tell him about what had just happened. That's when he looked at me, his expression serious, and told us that he had heard of that ghost town before. He and his friends had purposely avoided it. It turned out that place used to be a drug den. Over the past decade, law enforcement had raided multiple meth labs hidden in those abandoned homes. We had unknowingly walked straight into a place where we were never supposed to be. A group of friends and I had always wanted to go camping in the Nevada desert, so when we finally all had the opportunity to do so, we seized it immediately. It was a 3-day camping trip, and we made sure to pack enough supplies to handle the scorching days and the freezing nights. The first night was indescribable. I mean, people always say that the desert sky at night is magical, but I had never seen so many stars in my entire life. We spent most of the following day hiking, exploring the vast landscape. Our hike lasted for about 2 hours before we returned to camp and prepared our meal. After that, we simply relaxed, reading books and enjoying some music playing from the battery-powered speaker we had brought along. As the sun began to set, we welcomed what we expected to be another beautiful night. Unfortunately, we were wrong. We were all sitting around the fire, letting it die down so we could get a clearer view of the stars, when my friend Damien suddenly tapped my shoulder. I asked him what was wrong, but instead of answering, he simply pointed into the distance. Now, we were far from any civilization, so you can imagine our shock when we saw what appeared to be another person standing about 20 feet from our camp, just staring at us. I got everyone's attention, and as they all turned to look, the figure started walking toward us. That was when I decided it would be best to call out to them. I raised my voice and greeted them, asking if they needed any help. But they didn't respond. They just kept walking forward. By this point, they were at the edge of our camp, moving straight through it. We all stood up, repeatedly asking if they were okay or if they needed anything, but there was no answer. They didn't even acknowledge us. It was a fully grown man walking slowly through the middle of our campsite before continuing into the darkness. That night, we decided to stay alert, uncertain if he would return. Around 2 a.m. the wind picked up, and eventually, our fire was blown out. Without the stars overhead, we would have been in complete darkness. We spent the next 2 hours waiting for sunrise, and about 20 minutes into that wait, our worst fear became a reality. We could see the same figure lurking in the distance. We huddled close together, still unsure of what he wanted. A few times he approached the camp, but seemed to wander aimlessly rather than directly toward us. It was terrifying. Yet oddly, he didn't appear to want any interaction with us at all. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, We started packing up our things. Even though nothing had happened to us, there was no way we were spending another night there. As I packed, I kept glancing into the distance, wondering if I would catch another glimpse of the man who had been watching us. But he was nowhere to be seen. We left that place without a trace and without any intention of ever going back. When I turned 27, I decided that I wanted more adventure in my life. One of the things I had always wanted to do was hike the Appalachian Trail, so I planned a 4-day hiking trip and asked my dad if he could drop me off at the starting point and pick me up 4 days later at a designated location I had marked on the map and GPS. He was happy to help, and before I knew it, my hike had begun. The first and second days went really well. I kept a good pace for a while, and it actually seemed like I might reach the pickup point a day early. That would be fine. I could just camp out and spend the extra day relaxing and getting some good rest. By midday on the third day, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I assumed it was just some animal in the woods and didn't think too much of it. But then I swore I heard movement behind me. I stopped and glanced over my shoulder. That's when I noticed what looked like a bit of fur sticking out from behind a tree. The moment the creature peeked out, I got a clear look at its head. It was a mountain lion. It realized I was watching it and quickly disappeared into the forest. I felt a mix of confusion and unease. I had never encountered a mountain lion before, and I was essentially in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't just stand there, though. I decided to keep my pace steady and continued along the trail. But sure enough, about 5 minutes later, that feeling returned. I knew I was being watched. At that point, I figured it might be safer to cut my trip short. I stopped on the trail and quickly pulled out my map. I could feel eyes on me from somewhere behind a tree, but I didn't have time to figure out exactly where. As soon as I located the nearest pickup point, I called my dad. I think he could hear the panic in my voice because he told me to get to the parking lot as fast as possible and that he'd meet me there. I had 4 miles ahead of me and I did my best to keep up my pace. I had to stop a couple of times to catch my breath, but as I got closer to my destination, that eerie feeling of being watched started to fade. When I finally reached the parking lot, I saw my dad's car. I ran straight to it and quickly explained everything that had happened. We drove home, trying to put the whole experience behind us. But there's one thing I still haven't been able to forget. This happened about 3 years ago when I was hanging out with my friends Logan, Vincent, Charlie, and Bobby. My parents were out of town for the weekend. On Saturday afternoon, my friends and I were playing Battlefield 1 at Logan's house to relax and have some fun. A few hours later, we got bored and had nothing else to do, so we decided to take a walk along the boardwalk and talk about our plans for the summer. After discussing our summer plans, Logan asked if we wanted to check out an abandoned hospital. I didn't think it was a good idea because it could be really creepy and unsettling, but I agreed anyway. Around 5 p.m., we got into my pickup truck and drove there. We arrived at about 6:30 p.m. and I parked my truck near the entrance in case something happened while we were inside. As we entered the hospital, it felt eerie, but the hallways and rooms were empty. About 20 minutes in, we suddenly heard something that made our hearts skip a beat. A girl screaming, "Help! Someone help me!" Right after that, we heard a man's voice say, "Shut up." We followed the sounds upstairs, and when we reached the top, we saw a faint light coming from one of the rooms. As we got closer, I told my friends to stay still while I peeked inside. What I saw shocked me. A girl was tied to a chair. After seeing her, I quietly signaled my friends to move in and help. Once we freed her, she thanked us and told us her name was Mia. She also explained that she had been kidnapped 3 weeks ago while coming home from college for the summer. We decided to head back to my truck, but suddenly we noticed movement. coming from the staircase. We quickly found an empty, dark room to hide in until whoever it was passed by. After a minute or two, we saw a man walking by. He was wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, boots, and was holding a machete. Once he was gone, we silently left the room without making a sound. Just before reaching the exit, we heard him scream Mia's name. That's when we started running towards my truck. My friends jumped into the back, and I quickly started the engine. As soon as I did, Logan yelled at me to hurry up. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man charging at us with the machete. Without wasting a second, I stepped on the gas and sped away while calling the police. After escaping, we stopped at a gas station to wait for the cops and told them everything that had happened. We gave them the hospital's location and they went there to investigate. Shockingly, they managed to capture the man that night. It turned out that he had been on the run for 5 years and had a criminal record. An ambulance took Mia to the hospital, and after everything settled down, we went home, vowing never to visit places like that again. To this day, I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if he had caught us, or worse, what would have happened to Mia if we had never shown up.